First of all, welcome very much to this Retrofit London launch organised by London councils. My name is Councillor Louise Mitchell. I am Cabinet Member for Housing and Homelessness Prevention in the London Borough of Waltham Forest. Okay, and I think what I will do is just briefly introduce myself, just in case everyone didn't catch that right at the beginning. I will admit, I'm not the best user of Zoom. We're still working it out, even after all this time. Okay, welcome everybody to London Council's launch of the London Retrofit project. We're really excited to see you all here today. It's great that so many people have turned up and settled in. I hope you have a cup of tea, refilled your recyclable water bottle, and we will be ready to go. We have some really interesting speakers talking about one of the issues, well, the climate emergency. I don't know if you were listening to the radio this morning. The climate emergency is one of the defining issues of our time, crossing communities, regions. And even though I'm sitting here in my Labour town hall with my Labour mug, it crosses communities, regions, and most importantly, party political lines. We know, of course, that COP26, the conference begins in Glasgow on Sunday, on Halloween, fittingly, which is helping to galvanise efforts across UK politics and is shining a spotlight on issues and potential solutions. We know as well that there's been increasing public awareness of the climate emergency and a will definitely among Londoners to take action. And you're going to be hearing about some of those projects as we move on through the morning. In the second year of polling by London councils, 82% of Londoners reported being concerned about climate change. And most importantly, 89% were motivated to help prevent it. However, it can be really hard for our residents to understand what can be done when it comes to their own homes. Some of the solutions can be expensive or feel out of their control. Sometimes it can feel really daunting, knowing where to start. However, housing is crucial if we're to achieve our net zero ambitions. And we know it's currently responsible for 1/3 of London's emissions, or around 50% in the case of Waltham Forest. And as boroughs, we have to recognise this. In Waltham Forest, our Climate Emergency Commission made a series of recommendations we are translating into action. And we already have a programme of work underway to retrofit over 200 homes via our Green Homes Grant, London Local Authority Delivery Scheme. It's a snappy title that rolls off the tongue. We recently launched our Eco Show Home, a deep retrofit demonstrating project to showcase solutions to the local community and our partners. And I'd really like to extend an invite to everyone who's on the call at the conference this morning to visit the project after today's event. And hopefully somebody is going to add a link so that you can see what we've been doing and see where we are and see how you can book onto a tour into the chat. We know we can't solve the challenge on our own. Local government can only go so far, and that's why we're delighted to be co-leading with the London Borough of Enfield, London Council's Retrofit London programme, which we're here to formally launch today. As I said, the scale of this problem can feel daunting, and the scale of ambition can feel daunting. However, a failure to act is even more daunting in its consequences, and there is a massive opportunity for us to use this to create green jobs for our residents, to upskill and promote local growth, while delivering tangible benefits to all of our residents. At today's launch, we'll be hearing from leading London voices on retrofit in the public and private sector. And of course, we'll be sharing details about the Retrofit London programme, what it means and how you can get involved. I'm contractually obliged to tell you this. If you want to support the launch on social media, we have a hashtag, and it is #BeTheSolution. Okay, and just a few quick notes of housekeeping before we crack on. Please keep your microphones and cameras switched off. Please do ask questions using the chat function. And if you do want to ask a question using that chat, it's really helpful for us if your name and organisation are clear. So if the last person logged into the into your Zoom account was your 6-year-old, then update the name. That would be really helpful. I'm going to hand you over now to Mayor Philip Glanville, who's going to formally open the conference. So some of you may know Philip Glanville, Mayor Glanville, was elected Mayor of Hackney in September 2016, having previously spent 3 years as the Cabinet Member for Housing. He served on the London Legacy Development Corporation Board since 2016 and is currently, he's a busy man, the Chair of London Council's Transport and Environment Committee. He's co-chair of Thrive London and is also London Council's Digital Champion. So I'm going to hand over now. I hope someone is going to manage the cameras for me to Phil. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks for that warm opening. Being digital champion does not make me any better at Zoom most of the time, so I struggle with the rest of us. I'd like to echo Councillor Mitchell's welcome and highlight that polling from last week. We launched at our Borough Climate Conference. I think it shows really powerfully that Londoners really care about these issues and are really motivated to see change. As was said, I'm the Chair of Transport and Environment Committee at London Councils, and through that role take a lead on a cross-borough basis for our climate change work, and also sit on the expert advisory group to the Green New Deal, co-chaired with Deputy Mayor Rodriguez. So I'm absolutely delighted that we are showing this cross-borough working today at the London Action Plan launch. I think it's an absolute testament to the work of all the professional networks in London in this issue, and London councils as well as our partners. And it is absolutely vital that we crack retrofit for not just that journey to net zero, but a just transition for some of the poorest Londoners who are in fuel poverty today. We'll be looking at all of the discussions around the cost of living crisis and thinking about how they'll heat their homes this winter and in future winters. We know that our homes are responsible for 1/3 of London's emissions. Nationwide gas boilers in UK homes produce twice the carbon emissions of all of our gas-fired power stations combined. At the same time, 14% of Londoners live in fuel poverty. And as I said, the impact of gas prices, the ongoing health and economic impacts of COVID are all impacting and affecting those Londoners. We also know that when talking about climate change, Londoners are thinking about how it can help rebuild London's economy after the pandemic and want to see a really clear link to high quality and high wage green jobs. And this is something that taking on retrofit can do London-wide, but also bringing it down to individual boroughs, communities, estates and streets. And the research that has informed the action plan showed that nearly 200,000 full-time jobs could be created by working to deliver net zero in housing in London by 2030. And Louise at the start said I was once Cabinet Member for Housing. I have a huge amount of experience from leading previous programmes and the importance of retrofit and insulation in our homes. Domestic retrofit presents those real opportunities for climate and social justice together. It sits though within a wider context of London Council's climate change work, and many boroughs declared a climate emergency in 2019 or set out a clear prelude to an action plan around climate change. And London councils took that and created a cross-party inner and outer London joint statement on climate change in 2019. And underneath that sit 7 programmes that the London boroughs are leading and working on. And as you can see from the slide, the #1 programme is the Retrofit London work led by Enfield and Waltham Forest. But just take a look at the other programmes. There's clearly connectivity into low carbon development, how we heat our homes in terms of renewable power, and also links into the business work that London Councils and skills work that London Councils does. But I suppose what I just wanted to emphasise is just how absolutely critical retrofit is to what London Councils is doing, but that we are looking at those other areas as well. And we have already seen the work on consumption-based emissions, the One World Living work launched by Harrow before the start of the summer, and each one of these programmes will have a similar event to this rolling forward. Retrofitting is also a core component of delivering the London Recovery Board's Green New Deal mission. So this is the work that the Mayor of London and London councils are leading, and it has a very bold and very deliverable ambition to double the size of London's green economy by 2030. And within that, the Retrofit London programme is a core component of delivering on that mission, together with the programmes that GLA already have in place, that Innovation Partnership and the Accelerator. And I'm sure Deputy Mayor Rodriguez will talk more about that later. But what we, I think, are here to say through the launch of this report is that we will only deliver on retrofit if there's a strong collaboration between all levels of government, local, regional and national, key stakeholders leveraging private finance, the ability to work with our communities. And I think even more critically is also how all of us as organisations de-silo around this work. So I just think of my own local authority in Hackney. This is a planning issue, it's a conservation issue, it's an energy issue, it's a housing services issue, it's a direct labour organisation issue, it's a procurement issue, and it's a working with communities issue, and finance and legal as well. So we're going to have to think about how each local authority reconfigures around this agenda. The action plan that's been launched today has been developed through very wide engagement between obviously the boroughs, the lead boroughs, the GLA, private sector partners and others. It's been adopted really importantly by the London Housing Directors Group. It bears witness, I think, to the value that London Housing Directors has placed on this work. And I think their commitment to work, often behind the scenes, should be congratulated for their commitment and leadership. And again, hugely thank Enfield and Waltham Forest for playing lead roles in this programme. It doesn't come with a huge amount of additional resource, if any, but I think it shows the commitment of boroughs searching for solutions that they can share amongst their peers. I'm also really pleased that there's a range of partners who've committed to join the programme steering group, many of whom are at the launch or speaking today. This includes the government. I'm really pleased that we have BEIS and the Department for Levelling Up representatives joining us for this event. And we were also pleased at the start of last week to see the long-awaited net zero and the heat and building strategies published, and they represent a substantial step forward on this agenda. We were also, I think, for extensive engagement, both from London councils and the LGA, really pleased that the essential role of local government was recognised in the net zero strategy, and that there is that crucial establishment of the local net zero forum, which we will hope will bring together all of these themes and recognise local government's role in jobs and skills as part of a cost-cutting delivery group, and also the crucial role of local government as a delivery agent for this work. In the heat and building strategy, which I'm sure Matt will speak to in due course, we also welcome the announcements around further funding for retrofit, and again, the role that local authorities will have in local energy mapping and planning. But we also understandably believe that more government funding will need to come forward to move at the pace needed. We need to make sure that that reaches local authorities and communities who will be doing this work. Many of you will have heard London councils and myself talk about the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, and the work in this retrofit action plan has gone into that wider work that will be taken to COP next week and the week after, about how we're leveraging private finance to help invest in this agenda. And we obviously look forward to further announcements from government on this. The Climate Oversight Group provides the internal cross-borough leadership as well, which is critical to ensuring that we have a cross-council, cross-borough approach that maximises the synergies between retrofitting and the other programmes. So I think the other thing that's come forward really, really strongly is that communities don't want us to just do one element, one building element, one element of the community. So we have to think about how this, if you think about a housing estate or street, can also deliver climate adaptation and resilience. Just drawing to a close, I think today is a really important event around one element, as I say, of our climate action programme. We also have the London Climate Summit on Thursday. Please do come along to that, where you'll hear the Mayor of London and London Council's leader, Councillor Georgia Gould, speak. And we also are taking this retrofit work from today through those collaborative forums and the work on the action plan into another summit with the Mayor of London early next year that will hopefully set out how we will take what we're discussing today, the announcements at COP, the spending review, and these commitments back to London, as I say, how we're going to deliver it going forward. I'll finish by saying this plan is thorough and robust. It has a huge amount of technical detail, from conservation areas to spatial mapping. I hope everyone is going to get behind it and support it, enable us to act with the scale and pace that we need to ensure not only do we reach net zero, but those Londoners in fuel poverty no longer live in that fuel poverty and live in warm, affordable, cosy homes. Thank you.
Mayor Glanville, I think it's probably me now. So thank you very much for touching on much of what I was going to talk about. But let me unpack it a little bit more. If you could move the slides on, please, Alex.
Thanks, Matt. Just loading this up now.
Thank you. So whilst Alex is getting the slides up, why don't I start? My name is Matt Harrison. I'm a program director based in BEIS. I run a fund called the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and I've been doing that for the last 14 months. Thank you very much indeed to Mayor Glanville, Councillor Mitchell, and indeed Kate Hand of London Councils for organising this virtual event. With more than less than a week to go, rather, to COP26, I think now is the time to shine a light on the importance of decarbonisation, particularly across the building sector. So what I thought I'd do is I'd offer a few thoughts on the challenges to set the context for the launch of the London Council Retrofit Plan. I'm going to talk a little more about the strategies the government is already putting in place. And I'd like to offer some insights into the funds that are already changing or driving the changes that we need across the sector. Next slide, please. So there are around 30 million homes, schools, hospitals, community buildings, and places of work in this country. And most of those buildings still rely on fossil fuels for heat, especially gas boilers, but also coal, oil, and LPG. Now these in turn churn out millions of tons of carbon every year. And heat from buildings, along with transport, is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, accounting for around 22% of total emissions. So as a result, decarbonising our buildings is one of the most important ways that we can reach our net zero target. But focusing on buildings also gives us other opportunities. Not only is this reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and making homes less drafty and good for the environment, but we're also making them, our buildings, warmer, more comfortable, and better places to live and work in, all of which reflects in terms of the health outcomes of our residents. Next slide, please. If you could move on, please, Alex. Thank you. So what is the government doing about this? Well, as Mayor Glanville's already mentioned, last week, I hope many of you will have already heard, the government launched the net zero strategy and in parallel, the heat and building strategy, which set out the framework for reaching net zero by 2050. Now we have a legally binding obligation to reduce our emissions by 78% compared to our carbon in 1990 levels by 2035. And subsequently to reach net zero by 2050. Now, achieving this ambition within the next 30 years is a really significant challenge, and it will change many aspects of how we live, including how we keep our homes warm. The net zero strategy itself lays out the framework across all sectors. It includes transport and farming and aviation as well as buildings. And it recognises to achieve these goals, we will need to support major change at both the national and the community level. This includes making homes, workplaces, schools, hospitals more energy efficient. I think we've shot onto a different set of slides for some reason. Nevertheless, the heat and building strategy itself goes on into much more detail for the built environment, and it provides a framework for the approach, and the points and points to the importance of energy efficiency, the development of heating systems that don't depend on fossil fuels, and also the importance of understanding the role of things like hydrogen and other clean fuels in the building sector. Perhaps most importantly, the Heat and Buildings strategy announces a further £3.9 billion of new funding to be spent over the next 3 years as part of the spending review settlement, and that will really put the rocket boosters under the decarbonisation schemes that we've got going. If you go on to the next slide, please. So that doesn't mean that we're only just beginning. In fact, there are a number of funds that are already in flight. I've already mentioned that I run the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. And earlier this year, we did commit more than £1.3 billion to decarbonise homes through schemes such as the Local Authority Delivered Scheme, of which London has been very successful in securing a large proportion of that, and the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. Again, London was very successful in securing a very substantial series of funding through that fund. The government has already spent more than £1 billion on improving buildings such as schools and hospitals through the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. And this is helping to bring these buildings into the 21st century by improving insulation, replacing polluting heating systems with heat pumps and solar power. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, the government has just announced £3.9 billion of new funding for decarbonising the heat and building across the sector. This includes £800 million more for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, £950 million for the Home Upgrade Grant, £500 million for the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, and a further £1.425 billion for the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. Schemes such as these are not only improving buildings, they're supporting communities and giving people the homes and the public buildings that we need. In all of these schemes, we're working directly with local authorities and housing providers, and I have to say the support that we've had in working with London councils has been exceptional. This funding will provide great opportunities to progress the decarbonisation agenda. It will help grow the green economy, provide many, many thousands of job opportunities, and it will see the development of new technologies. And perhaps most importantly, I'm really pleased with the approach shown by London councils in bringing together this Retrofit London Housing Action Plan. We welcome the thinking behind it, as well as the very significant energy that has been put into the councils to compile it. We very much look forward to working with London councils over the coming years to share our lessons, to build knowledge, to drive change, and to achieve the decarbonisation of the building sector. So well done, London councils. Thank you very much. Alex, that's me.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was really informative. There is an opportunity now for questions. We have a few moments if anyone would like to ask Matt anything. There are a couple of questions in the chat already. One has come from Murad Qureshi, which is around heat pumps and how you might see those fitting into retrofit efforts by London or London's local authorities, or presumably you with your national role, Matt, how they would fit in across the country.
So we believe heat pumps has a very substantial role to play in replacing fossil fuel heating systems. And in fact, the heat and building strategy talks to an ambition of getting to 600,000 heat pumps being installed per year by, I think it's 2028. We are already, through the number of funds that we have already in flight, seeing the growth in heat pump installation. The supply chain is responding. We're getting more people converting from being gas fitters to being capable of installing heat pumps. And actually, we see the benefits all round. But none of this is super simple. We need to do this carefully. We need to make sure that houses are effectively and appropriately energy efficient in advance of fitting a heat pump. Heat pumps do work differently from a standard gas boiler. You have to think a little more about how you raise the temperature of your building and you maintain it at a quiescent level. So I think heat pumps have a very large future in the mix of clean heat moving forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And also thank you to Mayor Glanville, who has posted a link to the action action plan in the chat in case anyone hasn't seen it already. If you haven't already seen it, please do have a read. It has some really excellent points going forward. I would like to ask Matt there is another question. Okay, right. This question has there is a comment from Julian Will something, which is around money, and I think that's Matt will take that on board, that there is always calls for more money and we could always do more with more. We will move on to the next question, which has come from Tom Welsh, which is around the fact that the government is planning to, how is the government planning to square the fact there is a 2050 target for decarbonising heat and buildings in the UK, but London councils are going much faster and all have commitments to carbon neutrality by 2030, and how will that work? And there is an additional question around upskilling people to carry out green jobs. And then I think we will move on to our next speakers before we fall hopelessly behind time, if that's okay.
Great. So I'll just comment on Julian's earlier comment about fabric. In applying clean heat to buildings, we ought to take that fabric first approach. There is a standard called PAS 2035 that we're very much encouraging people to follow, and actually all of the schemes that we have launched recently effectively come with the strapline fabric first. In terms of the differential rates that different areas of the country and mayoral combined authorities will wish to achieve their carbon neutrality. So I'm not a politician, I'm an official. The government's overall position is to achieve it by 2050, and that's its ultimate commitment. From my own perspective, clearly, the earlier we can adopt these technologies within the limits of the availability of the supply chain and the funding to do that, then the better. The more that you can save carbon early on, it has a collective value moving forward. You save that carbon forevermore. So very encouraged to see an aggressive timeline for doing this, and we will be working hand in hand with London councils as the plans emerge and develop, so that we can share and learn from each other. I think there was one more question. Forgive me, it's gone off my screen.
There were some questions around.
In terms of the upskilling and carrying out green jobs. So for the spending review submissions that we have just made, we have been very much seeking additional funding to allow us to create a series of green job schemes that will actually encourage training and the adoption of these, getting many people to move off perhaps old carbon based skills and get into the green sector. So we will be pushing those harder and further. There are a series of funds that are already out there, the low carbon skills fund, and we're encouraging a series of developments of training capabilities that will be adopted by the technical colleges that will also see many more people get trained in this environment. So it's important that we don't just think we can do this. We have to create the supply chain and the capabilities so that people can actually get into these green jobs and actually see a sensible future for the next 30 years in helping decarbonize the nation. I'm going to stop there, Louise, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really appreciate you attending today and listening to you. There are a couple of further questions that have come in while you've been talking, and we will try and answer those during the next hour or so as we carry on. I'm going to move on now to a presentation specifically about the Retrofit London programme and the work that's being done in Waltham Forest and in Enfield. We have two presenters. They are Dominic Millen from Enfield and James McHugh from Waltham Forest, who both lead on the project in their respective borough. Dominic is Head of Climate Action and Sustainability at the London Borough of Enfield. He is, according to his biography, a passionate pragmatist who believes government organisations and individuals should act together to take climate action. So we can test this in the when we hear what he has to say. And James McHugh is Head of Housing Strategy at Waltham Forest, and he's been with the authority since December 2019 and is taking responsibility for shaping Waltham Forest's housing strategic response to the climate emergency and fuel poverty, his involvement with Retrofit London and delivery of the Green Homes Grants programme. Okay. Now, James and Dominic have some slides, which I'm hoping will appear at some point. And I'm going to hand over to James and Dominic now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. And now it looks like the slides have appeared, which is brilliant. We have the technology. Yeah, we want to talk about the Retrofit London action plan. If we can go to the next slide. So clearly retrofitting homes is a priority for the capital, and they account for around 1/3 of London's carbon emissions. And as Mayor Glanville was saying earlier, quality actually impacts on health and wealth, and there's significant issues with fuel poverty within the capital. Action on retrofit is supported at all levels of government, as Matt Harrison has just said, as well as by people on the street. So this is from London Council's polling, and just picking out a couple of things. So when asked if they would consider insulating their homes, you'll see that a significant number of people are already doing it, or would consider doing it, or would definitely consider doing it. And even replacing gas, there's a majority of people who are interested in doing this. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the programme objective and challenges, overall, we're looking to retrofit all domestic and non-domestic buildings to an average EPC level B or equivalent by 2030. At the moment, the programme's focused on domestic. The reason we put or equivalent is because when we started looking at the action plan, it was apparent that measuring by EPC alone didn't actually achieve what we wanted. So there are other metrics within the action plan which particularly look at reducing carbon emissions. How this will be achieved will involve fabric improvements, which we just spoken about, heat decarbonisation, so heat pumps, heat networks, and also increasing renewable energy generation. We identified overarching challenges, including demand and take-up, delivery and supply, some of the technical issues, but also a key one, financing all of this. If we can have the next slide, please. So where did this all come from? Again, I think this has probably been run through, but in terms of where it originally started, London Housing Directors actually undertook background work, and that then formed the core brief for the programme. It's been recognised that this is a strategic priority, so it's been jointly funded by London Housing Directors, London Council's Greater London Authority, and the London Environment Directors Network. If we can have the next slide, please. So in terms of an overview of the programme, it looks slightly daunting when you picture it like that. But what we're trying to say is that there's various stages. So we started with data analysis and defining principles. That involved looking at all of London's properties and identifying opportunities for retrofit within 2 pathways. We've developed an action plan, which we are now launching. And the next stage is to develop the implementation plan. So with a 2 to 3 year horizon, we need to really break it down into those very deliverable initiatives, interventions. And then finally, by 2030, we're looking for all of London's homes to have been retrofitted to some level. The reason we put 2 different routes there is it reflects that there's going to be various pathways. Not everyone is going to follow the same approach. So what we're looking for is that we work together to get to the same target. If we can have the next slide. In terms of the scale of the challenge, one of the important things from the data analysis is that it looked at 2 pathways. So it looked at an EPC B average as an interim target, and then net zero as a final target. What it looks like in broad numbers is total investment of around 49 billion for an EPC B average, and almost double for net zero. Average investment, similarly, is around 13,000 for EPC B and around 26,000 for net zero. What that in fact hides though is that there is significant grouping, both for some lower cost interventions, and there's quite a number of homes with an average that's kind of in the middle of the pack, and then you do get some outliers. So there are some 100k investments required. And then where that gets you to is a final average carbon emissions per property of around about 1.59 tonnes for EPC B average and about 0.48 tonnes for net zero. And you'll see in brackets, that's the relative reduction. In terms of net zero, the reason it's still showing emissions is because that's factoring in grid decarbonisation. If we can have the next slide, please. So what does that look like in terms of measures required? And I think it's really interesting that you can see the number of measures, fabric, someone mentioned. So you're looking at for EPC B around 7 million interventions, and then net zero, that's around 9. Obviously, there's about 7.8 million properties, 3.8 million properties in London. And so that reflects that you'll need multiple interventions on some of them. And then as you can see, in terms of the split between the two different pathways, fabric is clearly what we're going to look to address under pathway 1, so the interim. And then net zero, you have to do far more around heating and hot water. So again, heat networks, heat pumps, etc. And there's also some smaller things we can be doing, so lighting improvements. Another key one there is the role of PV. So we think that if you have heat pumps, you need to be looking at PV in order to provide the electricity to power those. Next slide, please. And then this is another really interesting piece of work that came from the data analysis, and it looked at skills and employment, and it identified we've got a significant challenge, but also a massive opportunity. So when we're looking at national priorities around good growth and the green economy, for interim target, you're looking at 110,000 full-time equivalent jobs at a peak in 2030. And you'll see that that ramps up from around 4,000 at the moment. In terms of what it looks like for particular types of trades, I think one of the interesting things is it's not all specialists. So if you look at net zero, it's about 200,000 full-time equivalent jobs, of which 25% are general builders. So you could upskill a number of people, and then they can go on and they can do other works. So they can build new developments, and they can also undertake improvements to existing buildings. So if we can have the next slide, please. So here I'll hand over to James. Has James joined us? Okay, I'll carry on and hopefully. Oh, there you are.
I'm here, I think. I don't know if anyone got that. So we built the action plan around 8 key principles on which we gain consensus across London boroughs. The first of these is that boroughs need to retrofit their own stock and facilitate retrofit on the whole of the housing stock locally. The second is that boroughs are vital in creating and shaping a stable and sustainable retrofit market. The third is that planning decisions and guidance should support low carbon retrofit. The fourth is that we need to move away from gas heating rapidly. And our contention for the next 10 years is that hydrogen is unlikely to be the answer at the scale and the kind of timings that we're looking at here. The fifth of the key principles is that achieving net zero will require energy efficiency and carbon data and metrics in addition to EPC ratings. So that was something that Dominic touched on earlier, was we feel that EPC isn't sufficient to really capture some of the efforts to reduce carbon that are needed. The sixth of the principles is that retrofit should seek to avoid a significant increase in energy costs. and that's particularly important for those households on the kind of lower end of the income scale. The seventh of the key principles is that our asset management and maintenance decisions should be consistent with this plan. And then the final of these principles is that boroughs must work collectively to develop the skills procurement models and to engage with their residents. So those are the 8 principles underpinning the action plan. Could I have the next slide, please? Brilliant, thank you. So the action plan is quite detailed and comprehensive in terms of its content, its justification and inclusion of case studies. It's themed around 4 specific areas which we feel kind of make logical sense to break up this particular agenda. So the first of the areas is around retrofit measures and plans. So this is the kind of what. And I think Dominic's touched on this in terms of the breakdown of measures needed to reach those 2 pathways. So there's various things about fabric, ventilation, heat, and so forth, and ensuring that those are bespoke to particular properties. The second of the themes of the action plan is I guess the how, and that's around the delivery model, skills and supply chain. So in this, we're looking at kind of our own maintenance programs for kind of larger landlords, whether it be local authority or housing associations. The second is looking at large scale procurement, so how we can benefit from some of those economies of scale when we're purchasing materials and so forth. The third is looking to see how planning can act more of an enabler to this agenda. The fourth is the development of retrofit skills. And then the fifth is the ability to report and monitor on progress against this action plan. The third of the themes of the action plan is around cost, funding and finance. So what we need to do here is establish more in terms of the cost per individual properties and the business case for investment. Second of all, to maximise the capital available to make the investments in our own stock as councils where we still retain housing locally. The third here is around a retrofit finance task force, and that would be looking at kind of innovative or new models of seeking finance. And then finally, in terms of the funding, is about private investment for private property. So how can we look towards kind of the bond markets or indeed just the regular kind of home self-improvement market and try and channel more of that into private retrofit. The final of the themes, which is of course very important, is around engagement, take-up and lobbying. So I think that there is a specific piece of work to be done in terms of engagement across different tenures. So the one part of that would be engaging across social housing providers to roll out measures and make sure residents are kind of aware of the benefit of the measures and are kind of willing partners for when we're delivering work. Equally, in terms of the private sector, that's possibly a little bit more complex, but I think there's definitely further dialogue to be had about kind of how we roll it out at the private sector and overcome some of the concerns from landlords and some of that kind of split incentive of delivering works where often the benefit is to the tenant rather than necessarily to the landlord as such. Another part of this is about lobbying government, and this is I guess kind of various different tiers of government, but it's looking at a very kind of objective, hard-headed kind of business case and trying to provide evidence to help inform future policy and funding programs. And then last but not least, is a bit of a call to arms really, is kind of this is a very kind of comprehensive, very ambitious program. And we're going to need kind of everyone firing on all cylinders. So I'm very pleased at the number of people on the call today, and I'm very much looking forward to how we can implement the action plan together and overcome this kind of common shared challenge. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? So one part of the work we looked at was around property archetypes and an area-based approach, and this is something that we're looking to refine and build upon. But in essence, what we're kind of thinking of here is about kind of how you scale up delivery by looking at certain sets of common measures across building types and areas. And I think in London we've got a very unique mixture of different architecture and archetypes, even down to the very kind of micro local level, where there's often not one single consistent archetype which will dominate. And within those property archetypes, as a result of right to buy and expansion of buy to let and so forth, we'll have a mixture of different tenures. So I think what we're looking at here is how we kind of apply things around the physical characteristics of the building. And we did a bit of further analysis to look at some of these main archetypes, and we've just got the three most kind of typical common ones on screen here. And the single largest of the archetypes is actually the solid brick mansion props and blocks and converted street properties, which account for 29% of London's overall housing stock. And possibly that's one of the most unique challenges when we think about the ownership of some of these, and the fact that many of those will be leaseholder properties with all sorts of freeholder agreements in place. So that's another area of the work that we're looking to kind of take forward and thinking in terms of the implementation. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So Dominic had the illustration of a mountain, and I think that's probably a fair analogy here. Is it is going to be a considerable challenge, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think with the action plan, what we're looking at is where we can kind of achieve those quick wins and deliver some of the early activities. So an example of this would be running a London-wide information campaign on retrofit, to raise awareness of the opportunities and key intervention points, such as when people are moving house, for example. Also to shed light on some of the unknown, to inform people and demystify retrofit. I think it's fair to say that retrofit isn't possibly entered common parlance to the extent that we might think. And there's a lot of kind of interest, albeit confusion, about certain technologies, such as we've seen with heat pumps and a lot of the media coverage over the past couple of weeks. And I think another part of this is to help amplify resident voices to communicate positive messages, and particularly using that as a kind of a multiplier effect, where we're looking to build on the enthusiasm of people for things to be done, and also looking very much at where we've got kind of really good case studies of working with residents to deliver solutions and being able to tangibly demonstrate the benefits in terms of their health, their well-being, their financial situation, and so forth. So I think we're starting with some of those kind of early activities to build a bit more momentum. Could I have the next slide, please? So why is the action plan so important? I think it's important because it represents a robust starting point. So it's robust in the sense that it was developed by a real wide variety of experts in collaboration with key stakeholders. We've had lots and lots of very in-depth conversations with all sorts of parties and boroughs and people over the past 12 months or so to develop this. It's also kind of at the point of initiation, and I think it's very much a massive first step, because it's setting out, perhaps for the first time, a kind of comprehensive approach at a regional kind of London level, backed by a very in-depth analysis of our housing stock in London. And I think as well, it kind of identifies a point of direction or point of kind of startup in that London's local authorities have a critical and key role to play here if we want to ensure successful delivery, in that we've got so many different links with different stakeholders, and those relationships, whether it be through kind of private landlords, through planning, through our kind of registered provider partners, through our own stock. I think we're quite uniquely placed here, and we've got that real intimate understanding of what our housing stock is and the demographics of our communities as well. So I think that those are why this is so important. Could I have the next slide, please? As well, another part of this is about the ability to kind of inform decisions with the evidence and looking at kind of analysis of indicative costs of measures versus potential savings. And no doubt some of these will change as and when kind of certain technology gets rolled out at a greater scale. And we can see here, for example, I mean, as I've said, there's been a lot of interest, in particular with heat pumps over the past 2 weeks, given the recent announcements in the heat and building strategy. And we can see there's air source heat pumps in the middle of this particular graph. And we can see that's probably at present one of the most single costly measures. But equally, if you kind of set that against some of the carbon savings, it also demonstrates one of the single biggest opportunities. So I think some of it's about being able to have that more data-driven and kind of evidence-informed approach, and looking at the kind of different metrics across cost, carbon savings, and so forth to help inform decisions. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now we've got the action plan. What do we do with it? So the first part of it is to prepare a more detailed implementation plan to sit underneath this, and that will cover the more kind of wider program delivery element, to look at kind of governance and engagement plan and so forth, and really break it down into short-term deliverables with KPIs and so forth. We're also looking to set up a practitioners group through which we share knowledge and get into the details of specifics, whether it be about particular installation measures or it be about planning guidance, engaging with private renters sector, looking at those kind of big kind of key chunky themes that we've got to break down. We're also looking to develop a delivery approach that can support a programme of this scale, and if possible, looking to secure resources for some of the programme management. That this is a considerable scale of a programme, and it's certainly possibly beyond that which we can resource with just the kind of current efforts from the two lead boroughs. So that's what we're looking at next. Can I have the following slide, please? So just a few key asks that we've got here, and taking the opportunity now we've got so many people on this call and people across government, locally, regionally, nationally. I think we've got three kind of key asks at present, and they possibly won't come as a great surprise. The first is about the flexibility of central government funding for social housing retrofit to kickstart this revolution. And I think looking at kind of longer term, more flexible programs by which we can draw down funding and develop our plans kind of more iteratively than perhaps has been the case recently. And I think alongside this, I mean, we're under no illusions that this is going to be fully 100% grant funded by Treasury. That's not the real world, and we'll need to bring in significant amounts of private investment and look at some of those institutional investors, pension funds and so forth, to supplement some of that and look at that mixed blend of funding. The second of the key asks is around collaboration and coordination, and we need to look at kind of how we equitably share the risks and the successes of this, and looking at what the kind of optimal approaches are to deliver this activity. And then just finally, I think what we're looking at various levels is that real recognition that retrofits, both in London and other regions, it is a nationally important infrastructure project. I mean, we look at the scale of the investment here, and it kind of it's got parallels to that, for example, of High Speed 2. And you look at the number of people that stand to benefit, you look at the impact on the wider supply chain, materials and jobs and skills. It really is a kind of critical project of that kind of nationally important infrastructure level, really. So those are our three assets around funding, collaboration, and that recognition of the scale of things. Thank you. I think that's the final slide. And at this point, I think we're going to hand back over to Councillor Mitchell for some discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, James and Dominic. That was a really interesting presentation about some of the more practical elements of the London retrofit plan and how we can turn that action plan into action. I'm going to hand you over now to Joanne Drew, who is Director of Housing and Regeneration at the London Borough of Enfield, and she is going to chair a panel discussion. We have some extremely distinguished and knowledgeable panelists coming to talk, and they're going to hopefully look at some of the questions that have arisen in the Q&A. There have been questions around upskilling and green jobs. There have been questions around different sorts of funding, and all sorts of things popping up, and I know that the panel, I hope, will try and answer those to the best of their ability. So I will hand over to Joanne now, who will lead the discussion. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks very much, Councillor Mitchell. So our panel today include a representative from government, from the GLA, from the housing association sector, and from business, hopefully the construction sector. And they are Peter Fenn, who is currently Deputy Director Housing Net Zero at DLUC. Peter and his team work closely with the various policy teams within the department and at BEIS on net zero and housing policy, with a particular focus on retrofit of existing homes. So exactly the right person for our agenda. Shirley Rodriguez was appointed as Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy at the GLA in October 2016. She has devised and delivered environmental programmes in London, nationally and internationally, for government and philanthropy, including previously overseeing a global cities and climate change grants portfolio at the London Children's Investment Fund Foundation. She's now working to deliver the Mayor of London's vision to make the city a fairer, greener, healthier and more sustainable one. This includes ambitious programmes to reduce air pollution across London, including the expansion of the world's first ultra-low emission zone, making London carbon neutral by 2030, and spearheading London's economic and social recovery from the impacts of COVID-19 through a Green New Deal. We then have Richard Ellis, who is Director of Sustainability at Peabody Housing Association, recently announced its merger with Catalyst to make it a very large housing association of over 100,000 homes, and having some really interesting stock typologies in and across London and the South East and beyond. So welcome to Richard. We then have Stephanie Pollitt, who is the Programme Director leading on housing at London First. Stephanie has over 10 years experience of working in both commercial and residential policy, and joined London First in 2019 to lead on the housing agenda, covering affordable housing, build to rent and build for sale. Before working at London First, Stephanie was Assistant Director at the British Property Federation, leading on commercial real estate at the national level. So welcome to the panel members. I'm going to start off with a question, but please continue to leave your questions in the Q&A section and I will pick those up. But I think it's appropriate if we start off with the first question around the opportunities and challenges that each organisation sees from this agenda, particularly with the focus on London. And if I can go to the Deputy Mayor, first of all, to answer that question, please.
Thank you, Joanne, and thanks everyone for having me on the panel. A number of the opportunities, I think, and the challenges have already been mentioned in the presentations before, but I guess the big one is I think people's understanding and awareness of how important retrofit is, whether it's people who want to do it or the people who are actually doing it, you know, the sort of housing officers or fitters or whatever. You know, we've got huge challenges to get to that really deep decarbonisation, and technically that's a really complex approach. The stock we have, as we've seen, is really complicated, and the planning rules that we have don't particularly facilitate that either, you know, with sort of conservation areas and so on. So I think all those issues need to be addressed alongside each other, which, as you know, people were saying before, is a complicated issue. But I think today's Retrofit London plan is really excellent in trying to set those out and starting on that implementation plan. And together with London councils, we've been working through the Green New Deal mission of the London Recovery Board to actually take some of this work forward. I think the other thing, around opportunities, again, the big issue is jobs. We have a huge problem about how do we ensure that people in London, their skills are upgraded, and that we're working for the new jobs to meet the sort of general ambition of London being zero carbon by 2030. And that does require a lot of different approaches. And we have, a number of opportunities through our academy work, the adult education budget, the work that individual boroughs are doing. I think that the challenge now is how do we collectively really up the pace and scale of what we're doing, and really make a mark and help London and Londoners get to that net zero target.
Okay, thanks very much. Peter, did you want to comment from a national perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the challenges that we've seen outlined are common to the country as a whole, but some of them will be particularly pronounced, I think, in London. I mean, we all know, anyone who lives in London knows that its great strength is diversity, but what we've seen today is that diversity does bring some challenges in terms of the sheer diversity of building stock, the nature of London with its kind of patchwork urban landscape, and the diversity of people that we're going to have to work with, and the diversity of people that we're going to have to bring with us, all with their own different, household circumstances and drivers and aspirations. So the sheer kind of multiplicity of challenges, I think, in London perhaps makes it unique. But then again, it has that unique dynamism and innovation and energy that, if we can galvanise it, I think, puts it at the head of the queue in terms of this agenda. Not for me to say what London's challenges are. The fantastic thing about this event is that you're also focused on understanding them, and that the work that we've done so far, in terms of understanding the nature of the stock, puts you in such a good position.
Thank you, Peter. If we can go to Richard now, very much on the sharp end of delivery with your 100,000 homes agenda.
Not quite yet, but yeah, it's coming to us now. So yeah, the biggest challenge, and is everyone said it, is financing. How do we deal with that? We've got to deal with building safety, and there's lots of other things that we're trying to deal with at the moment, and we've got climate change coming along as well. So it's how do we make that work financially, but also how we tackle fuel poverty. We don't want to put heat pumps in, which driving people into fuel poverty without doing the fabric improvements first. Planning, again, is a big issue for us, especially for our larger, older estates. But I think the biggest challenge for us is actually around private owners and private landlords, and moving those guys into thinking about this. It's not, I don't know how we're going to do it, but it is certainly a challenge, and this is one toolbox to do it. But yeah, that's going to be tough. In terms of opportunity, we'll make the environment better. I mean, it's as simple as that, really. We will create jobs and skills, and we can make some of our older buildings, which are part of the fabric of London, we can bring those into for the next generation. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, great, thanks. And Stephanie.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just echoing what everyone else has said, really, but I think in terms of opportunities, I mean, this is a real step change. The action plan, the programme, is a real sort of spearhead in terms of what absolutely needs to happen if we're going to reduce carbon. So I think there's, that in itself needs to be seen as the opportunity that is presented. I think in terms of the challenges, certainly in terms of what Richard has said, and Peter as well, just given the diversity and the breadth of the types of properties that we have within London, within the UK, I mean, looking, from build to rent, from build to sell, flats, that each sort of each part of that sector will have their own challenges. It will be difficult to retrofit blocks of flats which don't necessarily have the infrastructure, or sort of the infrastructure to accommodate things like insulation levels and so on. So there are difficulties there. Build to rent, although they're more modern and they have built to different standards, there are still some elements where funding is needed for new builds which are not eligible for government funding and so on. So there are challenges according to sort of which part of the sector you sit in, as Richard obviously has alluded to. So it's just making sure that we bring everyone along, and as someone said earlier, it's the whole industry firing on all cylinders, really.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So really kind of to sum up, the opportunity is really about addressing climate change, but it's also about the lives of Londoners. And we hope that by approaching the task in a way that focuses on standards and good quality homes, that this will also benefit on the life experience of residents as well. So on that theme, I want to pick out a question from Councillor Janice Long, who I think is at Brent. Hello. So many homeowners are cash poor and their asset is in poor condition. They may be in terraced homes or in converted flats, and they may be elderly or vulnerable in other ways. How can they be motivated and helped with the upheaval and the cost involved? I think if I can go first to Peter on that question.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the challenge is one that, you know, we all understand, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that for a significant proportion of people, some of the early things we can do aren't hugely disruptive and aren't hugely expensive. There's some quick wins, I think, here that we need to look at. Some stuff as simple as putting in some loft insulation or some pretty basic measures. So in all properties, we know we're not going to be looking at extensive renovations. They won't be suitable for all properties. But I think really focusing on some of those quick gains early on that people will probably find less disruptive than some of the other measures we're talking about as a key area of focus. I think it's easy to get daunted with the more extreme end of the scale here, but to be mindful of the fact that we can make really big improvements for some quite small incremental measures, not to lose sight of that. I think the role of you know, local authorities will be absolutely key. You know your people, you know your needs, you will know who are most vulnerable among them, and no matter what national support systems we put in place, that key human contact, that ability to have a conversation with someone, to understand their needs, to guide them through this process as trusted players, I think will be absolutely critical. And in terms of the scenario you just outlined, you know, of course we'll develop online resources and we'll develop national resources, and we'll do our best to make sure that people can access trusted information. But I don't think there'll ever be a substitute for that hands-on contact and the conversation and the ability for people to socialize their concerns and to have a conversation with someone who understands and can give them that trusted advice. And that's what we're going to need to see.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Shirley.
Well, we run a number of programs supporting local authorities to help with retrofitting, particularly sort of vulnerable communities, so owner-occupiers, low-income owner-occupiers, and private tenants, and so on. But with the limited funds that we have and local authorities have, you know, one of the key issues we're doing is lobbying government to really make sure that more money comes into London, London's boroughs. I think the points that Peter was making about you know, taking a staged approach is right. I think we have the challenge of a net zero 2030 carbon target, meaning that we have to try and do as much as we can do in the homes that we can do, but it's clear that there are some homes that are never going to be deeply retrofitted to zero carbon at this point, because it does involve a lot of technical solutions and also the disruption to homeowners or occupiers. I think that requires a sort of deeper analysis, I think, at local authority level. You know, you are the ones who probably know where exactly geographically the stock is, and then I think, you know, to the point that the colleagues made earlier about trying to look at area-based approaches and so on. We're running, for example, an innovation partnership working with social housing providers and building contractors to try and really look at how we really sort of retrofit as much as we can, deeply as we can, in certain homes. And this is the idea of this, is to really pilot these approaches so that we can start to bring down the costs, because the costs, as we've seen, are massive. But that sort of retrofit approach, that piloting approach, that testing approach is still needed, unfortunately, although we've been doing a lot of testing and piloting. But we've got to a good point in knowing what the basic measures are and how to do those. And I think, as Peter said, we really have to get sort of double down on those whilst we're sort of really bringing down the costs and the more complicated homes that we need to retrofit.
Okay, thank you. And Stephanie, how can the business sector kind of really make sure that its approach meets the needs of more vulnerable members of the community?
I think it's, you know, it's a two-pronged approach. I think, as Peter said, it's about starting with your quick wins first and ensuring that you can, you know, do your things like loft insulation really fairly quickly and fairly easily, and then it's also about the information that is put out there, and then in the long term making systems more affordable to install and to run. I think, you know, particularly for marginalised groups, the elderly, disabled, it's a bit of a minefield. I mean, it's a minefield for anybody, I think, at this stage, in terms of what needs to be fulfilled and when, and what can be installed in order to help that. So I think it's about getting that information, and it's business working with local authorities, because, as Shirley said, you know your patches really, really well. You know what needs to be addressed. You know your communities. So it's ensuring it's that sort of concerted partnership approach between business and between local authorities, and working together to make sure that you're meeting the needs of those that are most vulnerable, and all of your communities in that fact.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. And Richard, in terms of your work at Peabody, and you've no doubt got smart technologies that can prove a challenge to older vulnerable residents. What kind of have you learned about that space, and what would you recommend for this programme?
What have we learned? I think that it's just about enough contact. You just have to communicate and educate people and explain to people how it's going to benefit them. If they don't buy into it, it's not going to work. We've done enough retrofit projects where we've insulated something and then somebody's just opened the window just to keep it cool because they don't understand how something works. It's the same sort of thing with vulnerable tenants, just about a lot of education, a lot of hand holding, and then showing them the benefits so that we can be better. We've just launched an energy advice service, and that's all about just trying to get people to understand how they use energy, how they can use it better, and how we can together make things easier for them going into the future. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is really about how we can make use this agenda to make transformational change in places, which I think is something that many of us are involved in. So the question specifically comes from Mark Jenkinson, and how do councils currently decide on whether to retrofit or demolish and rebuild? Is there a standard approach? And I don't think there is a standard approach, but I'll let the panel answer that. But what could the future be for more place-based, joined up investment that tackles whole areas and kind of improves the outcome regardless of tenure? So can I put that question first to Peter, please?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a question that's best led by local actors, but in terms of the emphasis on, well, you know, I'm now sitting here not as a member of the Ministry for Housing and Communities and Local Government, but as a member of the Department for Levelling Up, and that whole place approach, I think you're going to see hardwired into our policies as we move forward, and that ability to galvanise net zero as a driver for change in places, I think, is something that our new Minister, our new Secretary of State, will be very, very interested in, and something that we as policymakers will have kind of renewed emphasis on, I think, as we move forward. How can we kind of unlock the potential of net zero and its ability to support us in a lot of other policy areas, be it general housing quality, because of course net zero is only one issue that relates to the fabric of a home. We know there are other health hazards and other issues that we want to deal with alongside. I mean, this is a sort of street by street battle in many respects, isn't it? It really is house by house, it's street by street, it's community by community. And, you know, I think we've got to make sure that any approaches that we do develop are capable of reflecting that nuance and reflecting the nature of, you know, the kind of rich fabric that we have in a place like London, and building that from the bottom up and really seeing this through a place-based lens rather than a sort of national one-size-fits-all, to use the old cliche approach, which simply isn't going to work.
Okay, so you'd welcome some ideas on some pilot approaches to that as
Absolutely.
part of our programme, hopefully.
It's all about learning, isn't it? We're all learning. No one has kind of monopoly of the answers in this territory. We're all on a journey, again, to use another cliche, but we're all on a journey together. And some things we'll get right, and inevitably there'll be some things that we don't get right that we all need to learn from. but having that kind of collective experience and that ability to share and learn together, I think is going to be absolutely key.
Thank you. Shirley, from the GLA perspective, place-based investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think equally, I think this is something for the local authorities to address, but I can tell you what we're doing at the GLA, which is helping to support that exemplar demonstration project approach. So we have a program that has been out, and we'll be launching the winners on Thursday at a summit that we're doing with London councils. It's our Future Neighbourhoods 2030 programme, which is really about taking that place-based approach, not just to retrofitting, but also all the things that we need to be thinking about to really make sure that the city is net zero carbon by 2030, whether that's the circular economy, transportation, looking at greening for adaptation and resilience, but also our buildings. How do we make sure that both our homes and our workplaces really contribute to carbon reduction through largely retrofit, or if they're new build, through following the London Plan approach. And the biggest sort of driver for this, or the biggest principle that we put at the heart of it, was really, it has to be done, with the community leading on it. It can't be something that is done to people. So that the projects that we'll be announcing are really striking in that how the sort of community organisations, tenants associations, etc., have really been working together with local authorities and businesses in the area to really set up their vision of what concerns them about their area, their place, but how that fits into the sort of strategic vision that the local authority has and the mayor has for London. And I think these are two great projects that hopefully Peter will send you some details, and maybe the new department can use them as exemplars or possibly help fund them. I think that's the thing. It's really understanding how these come from the community. And of course, we have another programme, High Streets for All, which is also about how do we use our high streets to really demonstrate again that sort of regeneration, how do we recover from the social and economic impacts of COVID-19, but also in doing so tackling the climate and ecological emergency. So how do those high streets, workplaces, shops also contribute to reducing carbon by retrofitting and so on?
Okay, thank you. Richard, do you have any examples of programmes at Peabody that you're taking which include decarbonisation?
So we've currently kicked off a project around what we call our heritage estates, our old Victorian estates, just looking at how we're going to make those fit for the future. So that's a 2-year project where we're working through all of the different technical aspects, the social aspects, the financial aspects, to see how we can make that improvement, because we want to keep the communities in the places that they are. Obviously, it's part of the fabric of the place. Another couple of things that we're looking at is, one, there's a heat from waste plant, and we're seeing whether or not actually it's feasible for us to take that heat, to use it to heat some of our homes, which is a form of low carbon heat. But I think the thing I want to get across is that, and we started talking with the London councils, as one of the reasons why I'm on here, is if we can share our data. We've all got houses if you take an average London street, there'll be a house which are private, there'll be a house that's a council, and there'll be a house that's a housing association. If we can share our data, then we can work together to do the whole street, or those area-based approaches.
Okay, thank you. And Stephanie, I know that many build-to-rent investors, operators, do some really good work in the space of whole place investment in communities. Is there anything you want to add from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the key drivers for the build to rent industry is making sure that it's not just about putting up flats, blocks of flats, but it's about creating communities. So very much like the likes of Peabody, for example, who you're not just creating homes, but you're creating a community, you're creating the green spaces. And retrofit and reducing carbon emissions will come into that, particularly around the build methods that some build to rent developers use, like such modern methods of construction and so on, which will all help to add that in terms of energy efficiency in the short and in the long term. And I think that's where, sort of going back to the opportunities, that's a key opportunity in terms of how we look at how we construct our homes going forwards. But yeah, I mean, lots of good stuff happening in terms of creating that, and particularly in terms of how we now live and work in our homes. So we, our homes are also doubling up as our offices, post-pandemic. So there's a real drive to make sure that they will be as energy efficient as possible.
Okay, thank you. And a final question to the panel, which is one around how do you think this programme needs to fit in and support the 6 other London Council's programme on this agenda? And specifically, there's a question from Simon Poynet about the plans that we have to make homes green in the literal sense, so green roofs and increased tree planting and sort of increased biodiversity in the kind of adjacent and wider areas, all really important things that we need to make sure that we build into our programme. So any thoughts on how we can make those links with other programmes and really deliver the most we can? So I'll start with Peter.
Well, again, that's probably one largely for London colleagues, in that I haven't been close to development of the sorts of other plans that reinforce this one. But of course, there's so many interdependencies here, aren't there? And it's understanding them, looking at how they interact both at programme level, but how they interact in the community level, a neighbourhood level. And that's clearly going to be one of the main challenges that we're all going to face. But it's also one of the main opportunities too. How can we drive change, as we just said before, at the place level? And how can this agenda help drive wider benefits? I think is going to be one of the key things we'll have to keep at the front of our minds. And I know that colleagues on the call and everyone who's been involved in preparing this plan will have them at the forefront of their minds.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Shirley?
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. I think the Future Neighbourhoods programme is an example of that. At the GLA, the Green New Deal mission is absolutely about how do you integrate the ecological emergency. When we talk about climate emergency, we often, we use it as a shorthand for ecological emergency, but we should be really sort of calling that out much more. There's a lot of guidance in the London plan. We have lots of funding programs at the GLA, which is really about green resilient spaces, because it's really important both for health reasons, adaptation reasons, resilience reasons, but also we know that during the pandemic, it was very clear that many people didn't have access to private space. So you have to try and make space for nature, space for greening, in all our development, whether it's retrofitted development or through new development.
Okay, thank you. Richard?
Yes, so just in specifically around biodiversity, we are actually going to bring in, or I'm hopefully recruiting a head of biodiversity just to knit together the new buildings with net biodiversity gain, our existing properties within London, and then at Thamesmead, where we've got 250 hectares of open land, and seeing how we can bring those together and how we can make those work for our residents and for us, and then how we can invest in it to as things get warmer, how we can make those spaces better for our residents. So at the moment we're just around measuring, but we're looking to see how we can link things together to get the best outcome for our residents and communities.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Stephanie, a final comment.
Well, I think, just to echo actually what Richard said, it's around that data and looking at what is needed and where you can add value, basically just in terms of the homes, in terms of biodiversity and part of sort of the general ecosystem of the local community, if you like. I think it's also in terms of more broadly having sustainability at the heart of everything that you do. It has to be sort of that overarching, this isn't a nice to have, but this is a must to do, and actually becomes ingrained in the thinking of of the likes of housing associations, or the council, you know, private investors, private developers. It has to be at the heart of the build. So I think that's a key one for the industry to get behind.
Okay, that's great. We're just about on time. So thank you all for the questions and the really helpful answers from the panel, which has given us certainly some more food for thought as we continue to develop this programme. I'll hand back to Councillor Mitchell now.
Thanks, Joanne. I'd just like to try and draw everything together. I feel a little bit like there are lots of neurons firing off in my brain with everything that I have learned so far this morning and the different tangents that the conversations have gone off on, giving me lots of ideas and things to think about further. On behalf of Joanne and myself from Joanne from Enfield and myself from Waltham Forest, to draw the event to a close, I'd particularly like to thank Kate and Alex and the team at London Councils for organising this morning, putting it together such a good agenda and giving everyone the chance to have their say. It's been really helpful. I'd like to thank our speakers, that's Mayor Philip Glanville, particularly Matt Harrison from BEIS. We really appreciate his time this morning. James McHugh and Dominic Millen, Peter Fenn, Shirley Rodriguez, Richard Ellis and Stephanie Pollitt. Thank you to everyone who's given their time this morning. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who in the audience who's taken the time out of their day to listen and hopefully to learn and to exchange ideas. Some of the sort of key reflections for me from the launch that we've had today and the ideas that are, like I said, firing off those little neurons in my brain are around some of the common themes that we've discussed this morning. I think there's a particular issue, I'm sure, well, hopefully we will all agree, around the costs and the scale of the pots of money available as opposed to the scale of ambition and what we need to achieve over the next few years in order to achieve that carbon net zero. There's been a particular issue highlighted and raised around green jobs and upskilling our workforce in order to install the technology that we need and to make sure it's maintained to the best of its abilities. And one particular issue that's been highlighted for me is around how we make this real for Londoners and how do we turn this from a Retrofit London action plan into action, and how do we make it feel like this is an urgent need for every Londoner with a home. That's whether they're a social housing tenant, whether they're a homeowner, whether they're a private sector rented tenant, whether they're a landlord, whether they're a housing association, whether they're a council, whether they're an ALMO. How do we make it their business so that they are thinking about how they can retrofit their properties and how they can help reduce the carbon emissions from our housing stock and help everybody towards that carbon net zero goal? It's been a huge amount to think about. There are still questions and comments firing in and around the Q&A and the chat function, to which I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you. If we haven't managed to answer yours yet, hopefully we will be able to do so after the meeting. Alex, I believe, was going to put a slide up that would have some contact details for James McHugh, Dominic Millen and Alex, so that if you wanted more information about Retrofit London, you would know who to contact. And I'm hoping that might appear at some point shortly. But if not, I'm sure we can work it out because we have everybody's contact details, obviously, from when you registered for the event. And if anyone's looking for slides, I saw that was a comment that was raised in the chat earlier. I'm sure again they can be sent round as part of a wrap up from today. I see something is changing on my screen. Let's see if that slide appears. There you go, how to stay in touch with Retrofit London. I think the only thing it remains for me once again is just to say thank you so much to all our speakers and thank you for attending. It's been a really informative morning. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've come away, like me, thinking of all the things that we could do and how to translate it into action in your borough. But thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon. Well, not soon. Hopefully we'll see you in a few years when we can talk about the success of the Retrofit London project and how much further along we are towards carbon net zero in our housing stock. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night. Goodbye.